One of the more famous passages in the Bible when it comes to the season of Advent comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, where the prophet says very famously, "Prepare the way of the Lord and make straight his paths." And it's a really interesting passage from the perspective of what it teaches us about our relationship with Christ and how we might advance in the context of the spiritual life. And so, to use an analogy to explain this particular passage, imagine you're living in the heart of a city, which is defined by all sorts of winding roads and various obstacles and whatnot. And you're waiting to receive a really important message, which is going to be delivered from outside the city. Well, if you want to receive this message in a really timely and efficient manner, then what do you do but prepare the way of the messenger and make straight his paths in terms of removing any sort of unnecessary obstacles? Or to use a slightly different analogy, imagine you're waiting for a helicopter to land to deliver really important medical supplies. Well, if you want to help this helicopter to land safely, then you got to realize that your job, in a certain sense, is not so much to fly the helicopter or even to send for the helicopter, right? Because the helicopter is already coming and perhaps is already hovering above your place. No, instead, you got to realize that your task in that particular circumstance is to basically clear the landing pad to ensure that the helicopter in question can land both safe and sound. In any case, the common denominator with regards to both these different examples is to basically suggest that God is not simply up there in the universe waiting to be found, but instead he is actually closer to us than we are to ourselves. Such that the fundamental task when it comes to the spiritual life in a certain sense is to dispose our hearts to be more receptive to God's grace, mindful of the fact that in accordance with the etymology of the word Advent itself, Jesus Christ is already coming and in a certain sense is already here. Now, obviously, in the great tradition of the Holy Catholic Church, there's a whole bunch of things that one might do to be more receptive to God's grace. Whether we're talking about cultivating a spirit of prayer, detachment, self-denial, or even rest. That said, perhaps I must suggest that for our purposes today, we might focus on simply one idea. This idea of explicitly choosing to receive and cultivate thoughts and ideas which come from the Lord, while explicitly choosing to reject thoughts and ideas which simply do not. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember once speaking to my spiritual director, and he said to me once, Eric, you'd be amazed how little thinking has to do with the spiritual life. And obviously he wasn't trying to downplay the use of the mind and the intellect when it comes to spiritual affairs, but what he was saying was that a lot of times we use the mind for things that the mind basically wasn't meant for. And then he went on to say, well, look, if I were to guess, I would say that roughly 90% of thoughts enter our minds we're called to completely ignore, in favor of the 10% that the Lord actually wants us to focus on. And then on top of that, he said this, you can tell the difference. You can tell the difference. Now, on the face of it, that particular exchange might seem kind of overly simplistic and rudimentary, but there's actually a lot kind of going on here. So I want to kind of walk you through this thing kind of step by step. So first of all, you got to appreciate that he was saying this thing to me, my spiritual director was, in the context of spiritual direction. So he was talking to me as a guy who's been a priest for 10 years, which speaks to the fact that this whole idea of the 90% versus the 10% is something which is meant to apply to everyone. And so the whole idea is that regardless of how old you are or how far advanced you are in a spiritual life, roughly 90% of thoughts that enter your mind are total garbage by virtue of the fact that you're simply a human being, right? So that's kind of the first thing. But you see, the second thing is this. Again, you can tell the difference. You can tell the difference between a thought which comes from the Lord and a thought which comes from the devil. Now, it might take time, right? It might take experience. It might take even a little bit of education. But the point still remains that even you, eventually in time, will be able to tell the difference between a thought which comes from the Lord and a thought which comes from somewhere else. And so, for example, there's usually a couple of things you can actually look for to tell whether or not a particular thought or idea comes from the devil as opposed to from the Lord. And so, for instance, a thought from the devil usually leaves you with a sense of sadness, discouragement, emptiness, and despair. So right away, that's usually kind of a dead giveaway. Another thing to look for is whether or not a particular thought or idea leads you to question your own intrinsic value or dignity as a child of God or as a human person, right? And so, for example, while God might say, well, look, change this particular thing in your life to become more happy, more peaceful, or more free, the devil might say something like, you suck, right? Or you're lazy, or you're no good, or God doesn't love you, right? So things which, again, attack your intrinsic value or dignity as a human person or a child of God. But you see, on top of that, a third thing to look for is whether or not a particular thought or idea leads you to have a negative impression, not just of the present, but of the past and the future as well. And so, for example, if a particular thought or idea leads you to think that things aren't just terrible now, but they've always been terrible and they always will be terrible, well, then that's probably a thought from the devil, right? It's probably not a thought from the Lord. Now, in contrast, how do you typically identify thoughts or ideas which come from the Lord? Well, typically speaking, thoughts or ideas which come from Jesus Christ are couched in a sense of peace, consolation, encouragement, and affirmation. Now, again, the Lord might give you a challenging word, but it won't leave you with a sense of hopelessness. It won't leave you in a state of despair. But instead, it'll have the sense of this is what you need to do to unlock the door. This is what you need to do to unwrap the gift, if you will. In any case, now that we sort of identified certain characteristics of thoughts or ideas which come from the devil as opposed to certain thoughts or ideas which come from the Lord, it still kind of begs the obvious question, what do you do once you've made the necessary identification? Well, when it comes to the 10% of thoughts or ideas which come from the Lord, whether we're talking about in the context of prayer or some experience in life or even an encounter with some person, perhaps I would suggest that the thing to do in a certain sense is basically three things. You got to name it, you got to savor it, and then you got to carry it with you throughout the course of the day. And so to kind of run through these things one at a time. First of all, you have to name the experience, right? So to clearly identify that this is something which has come from the Lord. This particular thought, this particular idea, this particular experience, this is from the Lord Jesus Christ. To name it, to affirm the truth of that thing. To kind of say to yourself in a certain sense, look, if it's true now, then it'll always be true. Because there'll be a point later on where you might be tempted to doubt the veracity of that particular experience. So again, that's the first thing, to name that experience. The second thing you want to do is to basically savor the moments. To follow in the footsteps of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who truly treasured every encounter with the one living and true God and pondered them in her heart. And basically what you're trying to do here is move this particular thought or idea from the level of the intellect to the level of experience, such that it becomes something that's a lot more memorable, if you will. In any case, the third idea, again, is to carry this particular thought or idea with you throughout the course of the day and to constantly breathe it in, almost like a spiritual bouquet, if you will. And you see, the whole idea here is to not simply make the thing more memorable, but to kind of keep the thing in your back pocket, such that when difficult or challenging circumstances arise, you can actually speak God's truth into these challenging circumstances to basically counteract Satan's lies, if you will. Now, of course, this kind of begs the obvious question, what do we do with the approximately 90% of thoughts which don't come from the Lord, but in fact come from the devil? Well, based on what we said at the outset, the answer should be pretty obvious. All you got to do in a certain sense is basically ignore these thoughts, which speaks to the fact that whenever we're in a state of spiritual desolation, which St. Ignatius defines as the heaviness of heart, which unduly affects our life of faith and our relationship to God, we're not called to dialogue with the thing. We're not called to engage with it intellectually. We're not called to weigh the pros and cons of the various options involved. No, we're called instead to ask ourselves a simple question. Is this particular thought or idea from the Lord? Or perhaps more specifically, is God calling me to invest even the slightest amount of time, energy, and attention in this particular thought or idea? If the answer is no to either of these questions, then again, what do you do but simply ignore the particular thought or idea? Now, of course, on the face of it, that might sound kind of easy, but of course, it's a lot more difficult to put into practice because it requires us to always be mindful of the fact that we're constantly living in a state of spiritual battle and we're constantly living in a state of spiritual warfare, which speaks to the fact that instead of consenting to any particular thought or idea which enters our heads, we need to learn to be more intentional. To be more intentional in terms of saying yes to those thoughts which come from the Lord and no to thoughts which come from the devil. Mindful of the fact that a thought only becomes your thought when you actually choose it. And so again, a thought only becomes your thought when you actually choose it. I remember once hearing the story of this Native American grandfather who was talking to his grandson, and basically what he was saying to him was like, look, within the heart of every individual is basically two bears, a good bear and a bad bear. The good bear represents everything which is good about the human person, while the bad bear, not so much. In response to which the grandson asks his grandfather, which bear ultimately wins? In response to which the grandfather says to him, the one that you ultimately feed. Now, for my money, I think it's a pretty good story, and perhaps I must suggest the same principle applies in the context of the spiritual life, and in particular to this thing we're talking about today. And so, for example, let's say you're going about your day, and within a span of 10 or 15 seconds, you have 10 random thoughts. Now, based on what we've been talking about today, especially the principle of the 90% versus the 10%, the way things should actually go is ignore, 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 ignore. Maybe entertain that 10th thought, right? Now, in the midst of that, you might be feeling kind of silly, right? Your heart might be racing, your emotions might be churning, the bad bear, if you will, within your heart might be roaring up a storm, right? But as long as you don't give up, as long as you don't feed the wrong bear, if you will, you're okay, right? Because again, your thoughts don't become your thoughts until you actually choose them. It's a really important principle to remember in the context of the spiritual life. Now, obviously, everything we're talking about today, it's going to take time. It's going to take practice, especially if you're used to giving in to the various lies and deceptions of your inner darkness. But trust me when I say that eventually in time, you'll come to realize in retrospect that God's love was always the truth, and the darkness was actually the lie. And may God bless you all.